Bom dia a todos, é um prazer recebê-los aqui, nesse dia tão especial para nós, da comunidade junguiana, o lançamento da edição brasileira da Vida, Lógica, da Alma, do nosso querido convidado, Mr. Wolfgang Giegerich. Mr. Wolfgang, é um prazer enorme recebê-lo. Eu, antes de dar a palavra para o nosso convidado, eu queria fazer uns agradecimentos rápidos para localizar esse momento do lançamento do livro. É importante marcar que a gente tem quase 500 pessoas inscritas para assistir a essa live com o Mr. Giegerich. Temos também, esse evento também está sendo transmitido dentro de um evento organizado pelas nossas amigas Andréia Cunha e Liliana Valéria, na cidade de São Pedro, no interior de São Paulo, onde está tendo um congresso junguiano. Andréia e Liliana, beijo, sintam-se à vontade na nossa celebração. E eu queria contar um pouco a história de como essa tradução foi feita. A ideia de traduzir o Vida Lógica da Alma para o português não é uma ideia nova, sequer uma ideia recente. Eu e o André Dantas, há mais de 10 anos, cogitávamos essa ideia, pensamos nessa ideia, que sempre encontrou uma dificuldade, tanto em encontrar uma editora capaz de bancar esse projeto, em vários sentidos, quanto também no exercício da tradução desse livro. Então, nós, durante 10 anos, tentamos formalizar várias tentativas e nunca fomos bem-sucedidos. Mas, como a insistência é um dos nossos nomes, em 2019 apareceu uma oportunidade rara. Nós temos um grupo de WhatsApp chamado Rubicão, que é um grupo que congrega estudantes, analistas, terapeutas, pessoas interessadas na psicologia junguiana, e surgiu a ideia de promover uma espécie de financiamento coletivo para a tradução do livro A Vida Lógica da Alma. Esse interesse ele é também decorrente do aumento de interesse na própria obra de Wolfgang Giegerich no Brasil. Muitos textos sendo divulgados, muitas leituras sendo feitas, vários grupos ao longo do Brasil se reunindo para estudar a obra dele, e nós, eu e o André, achávamos que era a hora certa. Então, primeiro agradecimento às 180 pessoas que fazem parte do Rubicão e colaboraram financeiramente para que essa tradução pudesse ser feita. Deixo aqui o meu agradecimento e o André para essas 180 pessoas. Segundo agradecimento à editora Vozes, particularmente na figura da Aline dos Santos Carneiro, que foi uma imensa parceira, colaboradora, comprou o projeto junto conosco, nos ajudou a viabilizar essa operação, entrou em contato com Mr. Giegerich, com a editora dele, e finalmente tivemos um grande êxito, que é o livro publicado em português. Aline, meus mais sinceros agradecimentos para você e para a editora Vozes. Agradecer ao meu soul brother, meu irmão de longa data, André Dantas, companheiro, amigo, brother de vários anos de caminho junguiano, e não havia outra pessoa no universo junguiano que pudesse ter condições de traduzir a Vida Lógica que não fosse o André Dantas. Eu sei que o André praguejou, me amaldiçoou ao longo dessa tradução, ele vai falar, mas, André, sem você, sem a tua presença, sem a nossa amizade, sem a troca, meu amigo, isso tudo seria impossível. Para mim é uma honra imensa dividir esse trabalho contigo. Eu dou a palavra para você, André, agora, para você falar um pouco. Por favor.
Olá, bom dia a todos. Confesso que eu estou um pouco nervoso aqui, enfim, pela presença do professor Giegerich, que eu tenho uma imensa honra de conhecer, não é? Tremenda admiração pelo pensamento dele, pelo número de pessoas também, né, que é realmente surpreendente. E vou ser breve, né? Como o Marcos falou, é um convite, uma insistência, né, em uma demanda que ele me faz há muito tempo, né? A gente tem esse projeto juntos, né, de trazer o pensamento do professor Giegerich para o Brasil, né, disseminar a obra dele, disseminar esse pensamento. E o Marcos sempre me falava, né, cara, você tem que traduzir esse livro, você tem que traduzir esse livro, né, traduz esse livro para a gente, né, você conhece bem esse livro, traduz ele. E sempre, enfim, soava quase que inviável pela densidade da obra, pela demanda de trabalho que seria necessária. E quando esse grupo apareceu, quando o Marcos criou o grupo do Rubicão, ele teve a ideia, cara, agora dá para fazer porque dá para a gente fazer um financiamento coletivo, você diminui um pouco aí teu ritmo de trabalho, né, na clínica, e vamos lá, né? Bom, quando eu vi, né, que realmente havia um interesse muito grande, eu senti que era o momento de pagar uma espécie de dívida simbólica, né, com o pensamento do professor Giegerich, porque, enfim, mudou tudo, né? Mudou todo o meu modo de pensar a psicologia junguiana, né? Eu realmente não consigo mais pensar do mesmo jeito depois de ter entrado em contato com a obra dele. Não foi fácil, né? Desde a primeira leitura em 2004, né? Eu entendi muito pouca coisa, mas eu senti que havia algo de muito profundo ali que precisava ser compreendido, né? Então eu retornei algumas vezes esse livro para tentar compreendê-lo melhor, né? E foi meio uma mistura de sedução, né? Que o Marcos me fez, de sedução e insistência, né? Que tem a ver um pouco com o espírito dessa obra, né? No começo ela é sedutora, depois a gente começa a ter algumas dificuldades na leitura, mas realmente é algo que vale a pena insistir, dada a sua profundidade, né? A complexidade desse pensamento. E, enfim, eu topei o desafio, como ele disse. Na metade do livro, né? Eu comecei a xingar ele aqui mentalmente, achando que eu tinha sido ingênuo, né, de ter aceitado, porque os dois últimos capítulos, especialmente, são bem difíceis de traduzir, porque são bastante densos e muito profundos, né? A crítica que é feita à psicologia arquetípica, a interpretação no mito de Actaion e Artemis, são, assim, de um nível de complexidade que, para mim, é inédito na obra, no pensamento junguiano em geral, né? Então, não foi fácil, mas, enfim, deu certo, né? Um imenso, imenso prazer e uma imensa honra, né? Eu estava conversando com o Marcos essa semana que, né, tá aqui, né, no lançamento com o autor presente, né, com o professor Giegerich presente aqui, é como se fosse a cereja do bolo, né, desse projeto em conjunto que a gente tem há tanto tempo, né, desde 2008, quando a gente fez o primeiro evento, eu, ele e o Joel Nascimento, para falar, né, né, das relações entre o pensamento do professor Giegerich e do James Hillman, na qual ambos, né, tanto Hillman como o professor mandaram as cartas, né, falando sobre né, sobre a relação, sobre as correspondências, as diferenças. Então, de 2008, né, para 2021, enfim, a cereja, vou colocar aqui que realmente para mim é a cereja do bolo mesmo, né? E é imensa honra, né, estar aqui podendo apresentar esse livro para vocês com a presença né, do próprio autor, né? Então, obrigado, valeu, Marcos, por ter insistido, e vamos lá, né?
Só para fazer uma recordação histórica, em 2008, eu, o André Dantas e o Joel Brinco de Vitória, nós fizemos um seminário sobre as diferenças da psicologia de Wolfgang Giegerich com James Hillman. E nós pedimos tanto a James Hillman quanto ao senhor Wolfgang Giegerich que enviassem cartas para o nosso evento, e ambos gentilmente enviaram cartas. Então, desde 2008, nós temos essa relação muito intensa. André, obrigado. E, finalmente, para a gente começar o nosso evento, Mr. Giegerich, é um prazer recebê-lo, é uma grande honra ter você entre nós. Eu sei que é uma exceção que o senhor está fazendo em vir ao público falar publicamente sobre a sua obra, sobre esse seu livro. Para nós é uma imensa responsabilidade, um imenso prazer, e fico bastante feliz que o senhor esteja conosco para poder prestigiar esse evento. Por favor, seja bem-vindo, a palavra é toda sua.
Good morning. dear colleagues and friends, I'm deeply impressed by what I heard from Marcus Quintaes and Andre Dantas. This deep appreciation means very much for me. Thank you so much for this heartfelt greeting and introduction. And now I will begin with my talk this morning. The publication of my book, The Soul's Logical Life, in Portuguese translation, is of course a joyous occasion for me and an occasion to express my gratefulness once more to all those involved in the enormous work making this publication possible, and to the publisher for bringing it out during these difficult times. But rather than talking about my feelings, I would like to use my time this morning to make a few substantial comments by way of introduction. Let me begin with a proverbial saying. The saying, he or she does not see the wood for the trees, does not see the forest for the trees. The accusation that this saying entails is not that you look so intently at one single tree that you are not aware of the forest as the whole collection of all the trees. No, the saying speaks right away of your seeing the trees in the plural, the very trees that make up the forest. But the problem is that you see them only as so many individual trees. Because your focus is fixated on the individual trees, you cannot rise to the higher level of a concept forest. In the concept forest, all these individual things, the individual trees, have become integrated into one singular, into one unit. This concept still contains a way that as individual trees, they have disappeared into this new conceptual unity. I mention this because this is also the problem of therapeutic psychology. The psychologists are usually fixated on the many cases, on the individual patients. They focus on what goes on inside the people who come to the consulting room. The psychologist's perspective is that of the clinical psychologist, or the clinical practitioner. But Jung said, for example, that, I quote, his analytical psychology bursts the fetters which till now have bound it to the consulting room of the doctor. End of the quote. Psychology, in his sense, is more and something else than the study and clinical treatment of people's psychological problems. The work with patients and their subjective psyche can, from a standpoint of Jungian psychology, be no more than a sideline. Psychology in Jung's sense has to be understood as the forest in contrast to the individual trees. Its object is the objective soul, whereas the personal psyche is inside each individual. The objective soul is the soul in which individuals, together with their subjective psyches, are contained. In much the same way that trees with their own particular characteristics are contained in the forest. The difference between trees and forest, understood in the way I discussed it, can thus serve us as a preliminary illustration of what I call the psychological difference. This is the difference that constitutes psychology, the difference between man and soul, between psyche and soul, or between anthropology and psychology. My book has the subtitle, Towards a Rigorous Notion of Psychology. By adding this subtitle, I wanted to stress that my book is committed to this crucial insight and deep concern of C.G. Jung. I wanted to make it clear from the outset that the topic of my book is psychology itself, not cases, patients, people, and their experiences. The question to which this book is devoted is, what is necessary for psychology in order for it to be really true to what its name, psychology, implies, namely to be the logos or study of the soul. What is usually meant nowadays by psychology in practical reality is instead the study of people's behavior, emotions, fantasies, and desires. With the question, what is required for a psychology that deserves its name, I also follow the footsteps of James Hillman, whose decisive interest was in revisioning psychology. In his book with that title, we find the statement, the proper measure of mankind is man, of psychology, soul. Once more, the proper measure of mankind is man, of psychology, soul. This statement is an expression of the psychological difference. It demands of us to move from the trees to the forest, from a conception of psychology as the study of the human or to human, to a psychology as the study of the soul. Hillman's dictum rejects the personalistic bias of conventional so-called psychology. The problem I began with contains another helpful insight. Although it wants us to see the forest rather than only the trees, we now have to realize that a forest cannot be seen at all. Why not? Because it is a concept, and a concept can only be thought, only be conceived in the mind. It is not a visible or tangible object. As long as seeing in the literal sense is what is demanded, the proverb does not make sense. But literal seeing is not really what the proverb is about. Along with a move from tree to forest, it also wants consciousness to stop clinging to concrete things, being dependent on the tangible, visible, and imaginable, and instead rise to the level of notions, ideas, general terms, universal concepts. Figuratively speaking, we could say it wants to bring about the move from the child who still depends on his fingers to calculate, to the mature mind capable of doing mental arithmetic. The move from the visible and imaginable to the noetic is so important in psychology because, as the philosopher George Berkeley pointed out, the soul always thinks. The soul thinks even when on the face of it, it desires, is driven by emotions or entertains images, just like the child indeed does arithmetic, even when it still needs to use its fingers or apples and pears to do sums. With these comments, I have built a bridge to one term in the main title of my book, the term logical, or at least to one first aspect of it. Logical refers to the logos character, the noetic character of the soul's reality. Mythologically, the soul's logos character comes out, for example, in the fact that for the early Greeks, the soul was something that, in contrast to human emotional life, became relevant only after death. The souls have their authentic place in the empirically not existing underworld. They are ghostly, bodiless, bloodless, cold, shadow-like, and can only whisper. On a very different theoretical level, the logos character likewise comes out in Jung's theory that the soul consists mainly of archetypes, because, according to him, archetypes are abstract patterns, structures, merely contentless forms. They need to be strictly distinguished from archetypal images in which these patterns appear already embodied and enfleshed and immersed into a seemingly empirical reality. The main access to the soul for us is, of course, precisely through myths, dreams, and other imaginal material. But these imaginal phenomena are not themselves the soul. We, as psychologists, must not confuse them with the soul itself. They are merely the sensual garment in which the soul dresses itself for ordinary human consciousness, and in which it both reveals and conceals itself. Psychology must not take the imaginal form at face value. It must not fall for the imaginal form. What all this means can become clear in the last chapter of my book, in which I work extensively with the myth of Actaeon and Artemis, which ends with the Dionysian dismemberment of Actaeon. When reading this chapter, it is especially important to keep the psychological difference and the notion of the soul's logical life in mind, as well as what I said about the focus of my book, namely that the focus is that of rigorous psychology. Otherwise, it would be all too easy to misconstrue what my discussion of the Actaeon myth is about. By way of a warning, I will now briefly discuss 3 very likely mistakes and thereby highlight a few more crucial insights. The first mistake would be to try to take the myth personally. That is, to apply the myth to oneself, as if the myth were indirectly speaking about us humans. In this sense, one could read it, for example, as a model that shows us what could or ideally should happen to us in a deep personal individuation process. One could get the idea that we all should undergo a kind of Dionysian dismemberment as an essential existential experience. In general, not only with respect to the Actaeon story, we could call this type of application to oneself the exploitation of myths or other imaginal material by and for the ego. The exploitation of myths by and for the ego. For me as a psychologist, this myth does not speak about us at all. It is not of immediate and personal existential relevance. No, in it, the soul speaks quite coldly and objectively only about itself and for its own purposes. The myth expresses the soul's own inner need. It describes one necessity of the soul's own logical life, one particular way of its own self-realization. The myth has nothing to do with us. If the purpose of psychology is soul-making, that is to say, serving the soul in such a way that it can become real, then it is psychology that needs to be initiated into the Actaeon myth, not we. Psychology, the objective standpoint from which alone such a thing as soul can be apperceived in the first place. This psychology has to be the addressee of the myth. It is psychological consciousness that needs to follow Actaeon and undergo a Dionysian dismemberment. This dismemberment is then not a frightful and highly emotional experience. It is quite soberly a transformation of the logical constitution of that consciousness that wants to be a psychological one. Dionysian dismemberment means here the destruction or alchemical decomposition of ordinary ego consciousness's naturalistic standpoint, as well as of the emphatically imaginal consciousness. The initiation rites in indigenous cultures typically used to have as one essential element the purpose of living through a death experience. The aim was to thereby make possible the life of a mature adult who lives his life as a logically already deceased person, as one who does not have death in front of himself in the future, but psychologically behind himself. This kind of initiation was a personal and decidedly existential experience. Now, what for the initiates of archaic indigenous cultures was rightly a personal experience, for the modern psychologist has to be the death or deconstruction of the ordinary logical constitution of that consciousness that wants to do psychology, a methodological transformation. It is easy to see that the difference between archaic initiations and the modern transformation of consciousness, that this is the same difference on the practical level as the theoretical one mentioned before, namely the difference between myth, which inevitably comes in imaginal form, and psychology that must not fall for this imaginal form. The second mistake concerns how one views the figures occurring in myth. It is obviously so easy, so seductive to read a myth more or less the same way as we read our novels or short stories, which are about people who have their own particular characters, desires, fears, intentions, etc. But myth is not about people-like beings. Actaeon is not moved by a desire to go hunting. He does not get sexually aroused when seeing naked Artemis. He does not feel remorse, nor does he suffer from being torn apart by his own dogs. By the same token, Artemis is not enraged by Actaeon's intrusion, and she does not want to revenge herself. The figures in myths are not persons. They are visualizations and personifications of concepts, or better, of functions. Their behavior is not due to any personal motivation. Rather, their actions are the step-by-step spelling out of the different facets of what they are, of the internal logic of that particular function that they in each case represent. These figures simply play their allotted roles dictated by the higher objective necessity of the concept or soul truth that the myth portrays. We could call the second mistake that of smuggling a feeling ego, a modern subject, into the figures. The third mistake is close to the second. It consists in viewing the figures in myth as separate individuals like people in real life, and seeing their actions and interactions with others as happenings, sort of as contingent events in analogy to real life interactions. But here again, I have to stress that from a psychological point of view, in myths, nothing is happening. And the figures in myth have no separate existence. Rather, in each particular myth, these figures are from the outset coexistent counterparts of each other and mutually define each other. In real life, when one person, say a husband, dies, another person, in my example, as mythology shows, the archetypes or the logic of soul truths are not point-like static entities. The fact that they have such an inner complexity of their logic is one main reason why I speak of the soul's logical life. They are vibrant with life, but this life is logical life. Here, at the end of my talk, I can finally describe the second aspect that the term logical has in my psychology. It refers to the self-unfolding internal dynamic that prevails in such soul truths, and it refers to the inner consistency, indeed the character of absolute necessity of all the different moments and aspects which makes, for example, of a myth, a coherent, tightly knit whole. Thank you very much for your attention. I don't hear anything.
Desculpa, meu microfone estava fechado. Mr. Giegerich, obrigado pela apresentação. É uma ótima introdução à sua obra. Nós decidimos o seguinte, Mr. Giegerich, nós vamos fazer algumas perguntas sobre o livro, sobre a sua obra. Nós convidamos algumas pessoas que têm maior intimidade com o seu pensamento. Então, a gente vai aproveitar esse momento para fazer um grupo de perguntas para o senhor. Eu vou começar. Eu queria fazer uma pergunta mais introdutória, Mr. Giegerich. O senhor tem uma obra muito vasta, quase 200 artigos, uma coleção imensa de livros publicados. Eu separei 5 momentos da sua obra que eu queria nomear da seguinte maneira: a revista Gorgo, a revista alemã de psicologia arquetípica, na década de 70, os textos da bomba atômica, também da década de 80, seus 2 livros em alemão, A Psicologia do Ânimos e o Matanças, 94 e 93, um artigo seu chamado O Fim do Significado e o Nascimento do Homem, e os textos mais posteriores ou recentes que eu colocaria sobre os textos da psicologia como disciplina da interioridade. A minha pergunta para o senhor é: onde o livro Vida, Lógica da Alma entra nesse longo percurso que o senhor criou? Ele marca uma transição no seu pensamento? Ele é uma passagem de um momento teórico para o outro? Qual é o lugar teórico do livro Vida, Lógica da Alma dentro da sua produção teórica, Mr. Giegerich?
Well, that's a complicated question. I just had occasion to look at my book, my German book, Animus Psychologie, Animus Psychology, because some people want it to be to come out in a 2nd edition. And I discovered that very much of what I said in that book went into the soul's logical life. So I think the soul's logical life is not sort of a new beginning, a decisive breakthrough, but rather a continuous development that had begun much earlier. I started out as an enthusiastic follower of Hillman, and then slowly noticed that I couldn't quite go along with some main aspects of imaginal psychology, and especially when Hillman turned to the world, cosmology, I became critical of essential points in his thinking. And this happened earlier, maybe 10 years earlier, to the publication of The Soul's Logical Life. But that may be considered a certain new beginning in my psychological development, this earlier moment. And then the publication of the Soul's Logical Life is a kind of harvest of a long development since this earlier moment. Does that answer your question?
Perfeito, perfeito. Me ajuda a localizar. Muito obrigado. André Dantas, André, contigo, por favor.
Bom, novamente agradecer a presença do professor, né? Agradecer mais esse texto que ele nos brindou, né? Das centenas que ele já escreveu, que serve de uma ótima introdução para o livro. E vou ler aqui a minha pergunta, né, para facilitar. Bom, na vida lógica da alma, o senhor fala do cyberespaço como a expressão da corrente principal da nossa civilização, que é a do estabelecimento de uma existência absolutamente livre da verdade, portanto, livre da alma, a qual a psicologia atual se junta enquanto psicologia do ego. Mas em outro texto, sobre a web, né, a partir do ponto de vista da alma, o senhor escreveu que a internet né? E aqui citando o texto, abre aspas, né? A internet, então, deve ser compreendida como a representação concretamente visível da vida lógica da alma, e da alma como vida lógica, né? Fim da citação. Como conjugar essas duas afirmações? Há uma mudança de perspectiva no tempo que separa um texto do outro, ou a verdade da nossa época é que ela é uma época da não-verdade, né? A época que o senhor chama de modernidade midiática. É uma época regida pelo entretenimento, sensacionalismo e fake news. Se esses três fenômenos são expressões de uma época cuja verdade é a não-verdade.
Well, this is a very important question. And of course, I can only say something sort of preliminary about it, because the real answer to this question will only slowly come out in the historical development. I think that on the face of it, what you pointed to is, of course, a clear contradiction. But I think it is nevertheless something that goes together, because it could be that the idea of the truthlessness is the first appearance of what from the other side is the legitimate representation of the new form of soul. I work a lot with the alchemical dictum, nature loves nature, nature fights or overcomes nature, and nature enjoys itself. I have to translate these, the Latin now in my own words. It's not the exact quotation. There are three stages of this dictum by Pseudo-Demokritos. There is a first state of the soul in which it is in harmony with itself. A naive, syntonic relationship to itself. And then there is a division. The soul divides and tries to overcome itself, to rise to a new level. And then there is a final state in this dictum, or according to this dictum, in which maybe a new harmony on this new level is achieved. Now, I think the fact of truthlessness is, in our time, is overly impressive, and I think we just need to think of the last American President Trump to see sort of an embodiment of this truthlessness. But I think this is part of the deconstruction with which the soul attacks its old form in order to raise itself to a completely new form. The new form is the form that we have in the internet, in artificial intelligence, in algorithms, and so on. You know, our old form is determined by myth, archetypal images, and I think in the times that are already coming now, they lose their validity. And just as I mentioned in my talk today, that the child uses fingers to count or reckon. The adult can calculate in his mind. And now we calculate with computers or calculators. There is a clear change. The soul moves out of the mind and becomes objectified in a technological sense. Just listen to what the concept artificial intelligence implies. It's an alienation of intelligence from the human being. It's outside, it's independent, it's a representation of the autonomous objective psyche. And so in this sense, on the one hand, truthlessness is the character that we see and maybe suffer from, but on the other hand, it's the beginning of a new style in which the autonomous soul has given itself the authentic representation. I don't know whether my answer could satisfy you.
Eu acho que há muitas coisas aqui para pensar, né?
Obrigado, André. Mr. Giegerich, nós temos aqui em Curitiba, no sul do país, um grupo chamado Arqué, que é um grupo de jovens analistas, terapeutas junguianos que estudam há muito tempo a sua obra, com bastante rigor. Eu vou convidar 2 pessoas desse grupo para fazer as perguntas, tá? Diogo, contigo, por favor.
Olá, olá. Obrigado, Marcos, pela introdução. Olá, professor Giegerich. A minha pergunta, acredito que vai de encontro com algum... Acredito que a minha pergunta vai de encontro com os equívocos que o senhor postulou na sua fala. A pergunta é a seguinte, eu anotei para não me perder. Há uma tendência do pensamento junguiano de enfatizar o aspecto atemporal dos arquétipos enquanto deuses e mitos. Porém, eu percebi nos seus escritos que tem que haver um maior cuidado com a história e reconhecer a singularidade cultural antes de partir para generalizações e eternalizações. O poeta Charles Bukowski escreveu: prefiro ouvir sobre um vagabundo americano vivo do que sobre um deus grego morto. Eu acredito que, de alguma forma, essa frase está de sintonia com o que você propõe, que os mitos estariam obsoletos para a nossa situação atual da alma. E me corrija se eu tiver entendido errado. Eu gostaria de perguntar, então, qual o lugar dos mitos para a PDI, para a psicologia como disciplina da interioridade, e se a gente deveria abandonar de vez os estudos da mitologia e da religião comparada nesse aspecto da psicologia individual e de consultório.
Yeah, it's a very significant issue. I would say you're right. My theory is that myths are becoming obsolete. The Greek gods, for example, are becoming obsolete or have already been obsolete for a long time. And maybe now even Christianity may be in the process of becoming obsolete. But this does not mean that they lose their value. Just like we can really appreciate still today Greek tragedies or the Iliad or Dante's work or Shakespeare, history does not mean that what is part of the past has absolutely no relevance for us. We can learn from them, but the point is they are not the depiction and representation of our present day reality. And for psychology, I think it is very essential that we become aware of what the adequate expression and representation of our modern logical situation is, because here I cite an idea of Jung's, who said once about persons who have become neurotic or so, consciousness has consciousness does not understand how its world, consciousness's world, has changed, and how consciousness would have to change in its attitude in order to be adapted again. Myth, I think, is the form developed during the time of agricultural societies. We haven't been living in agriculture, in the agricultural world, for centuries. Our world is an industrial world, and now we are even moving beyond the industrial world into the information age. And so the old forms of expressions do not adequately express our modern problems anymore. And if we use the old models to explain modern problems, it doesn't work. But it doesn't mean that we cannot learn a lot from the ancient myths and other stories.
Obrigado, Diogo. Mr. Giegerich, nós temos ainda 4 perguntas. O senhor tem disponibilidade para que a gente possa fazê-las?
Yes.
Ok. Kátia, vamos lá? Contigo, por favor.
Bom dia a todos. Queria dizer ao professor Giegerich que estamos muito tocados por sua presença neste singelo evento do Brasil. E principalmente que somos psicólogos transformados por sua psicologia, que nos ensina a pensar psicologicamente. No seu livro Vida, Lógica da Alma, o senhor utiliza o mito de Actium e Ártemis para mostrar a entrada no território selvagem e como a alma pede para ser dilacerada, sendo este rito a entrada no pensamento psicológico. A minha pergunta é: qual o sacrifício exigido pela sua psicologia, qual o desmembramento dionisíaco e lógico necessário para a transformação da consciência na modernidade. Obrigada.
Well, I discussed a little bit of this question in my talk today. The Dionysian dismemberment is sort of the entrance gate to psychological thinking. If we do not understand the motif of Dionysian dismemberment imaginally or mythologically anymore, but understand it as the logical, methodological transformation of consciousness. Now, if consciousness wants to be a psychological one, it has to leave what the alchemists called the unio naturalis, the natural union. They has to leave that behind and pass through this process of nigredo, decomposition, putrefaction, and so on, and be reconstituted. It's a reversal. It's a real transformation that is necessary to understand psychologically what appears as ordinary happenings. Yeah, maybe I'll stop here for this question. If you have some further comment or question on this, please ask it.
Perfeito. Vou dar lugar para a próxima pergunta.
Obrigado, Kátia. Mr. Giegerich, a próxima pergunta é da Sônia Carvalho. Sônia Carvalho é analista junguiana, ela não fará a pergunta, eu vou ler aquela pergunta que ela me mandou, mas ela está assistindo, ela lhe saúda, agradece os e-mails trocados com o senhor e lhe pergunta sobre a tão difícil PDI. A pergunta é o seguinte: faz sentido a conotação clássica consciência masculina mais logos e consciência feminina mais eros? Ou essas terminologias se referem ao conteúdo da consciência? Ela continua. As pessoas se referem ao logos como algo distinto do eros, como se o primeiro fosse mais ligado à separação, à discriminação, e o último ao afeto, ao sentimento e à união. Seguindo Heráclito, que introduziu a noção logos no pensamento ocidental, logos é o que dá subsistência às coisas. Nesse sentido, ela pergunta: ter a capacidade de ordenar não seria necessariamente também ter a de unir?
I wonder whether it is still meaningful to divide soul topics into male and female aspects. Because I think once you enter the sphere of logos, the difference doesn't make sense. That's a naturalistic difference. And there is logos and thought in love, and in in Logos, there is also the feminine aspect. That it's a new situation. As I mentioned before, that mythology corresponds to the situation of archaic agricultural society. And I think on that level of culture and that level of consciousness, the whole culture was dominated by the opposites of male and female aspects and this tension. But if you enter the modern situation of algorithms and information technology, this difference doesn't really make sense anymore. Now we have to distinguish between the objective psyche, where this doesn't make sense anymore, and the personal or subjective psyche, where we are still men and women and have our corresponding feelings and desires. And this is, however, something that I think is psychologically not relevant anymore. That belongs only to the personal, private psyche. It has nothing to do with the soul's own development. The soul tries to go beyond to a level on which these old differences, these old opposites, are not valid anymore. They have already been united and overcome.
Obrigado. Sônia, obrigado pelo você ter enviado a pergunta. Eu vou chamar Gustavo Beck, nosso amigo, Mr. Giegerich. Gustavo Beck é um amigo mexicano, conhece também muito a obra do senhor. Ele também quer fazer uma pergunta. Gustavo, contigo. Gustavo?
Good morning, good evening, Professor. It's wonderful to listen to you. It's a breath of fresh air, really. I would like to situate my question in that I do study your work, but I am by no means a scholar, and I think I'm still at the level of misunderstanding a lot of your work. So my question is meant to clarify a very specific bump that I run into, which has to do with emotion particularly. When reading you, something that's really useful for me is your critique of archetypal psychology, and specifically Hillman's and Hillman followers' handling of images and emotions and feelings, which is sort of implicitly personalistic. But what I wonder, because I was looking into your books yesterday, and there is almost no reference to Rafael López Pedraza, who is, for me, another version of archetypal psychology, and I think has a much more psychological understanding of feeling and emotion, which I don't find personalistic, personally. But I've never heard you address his own understanding of what he calls the soul's movement, which he accesses mainly through emotion and through the body. And I was wondering if you consider his particular approach non-psychological or personalistic, or just what your general thoughts about his approach to soul. Like what do you, because I think that his specific version of archetypal psychology is very different from Hillman's.
Yes. I agree that I didn't make much use of López Pedraza's work, I must admit, though I I'm familiar with it. His work on Picasso and on Hermes and so on. But your particular question receives a twofold answer. I think it is not, his work on emotion is not personalistic in the same way as archetypal psychology's work is usually in this area. But nevertheless, emotion belongs to the natural psyche. Emotion is body. It's rooted in the body. And the body is always an individual. But the soul's logical life is something that is not based in the body. It's the sort of like the atmosphere, the climate all around us. It's the structure of consciousness in which then our emotions, our perceptions, our experience happen, and through which they may be informed and guided. So I think Petraza's work, as far as I haven't looked at it recently, so it's not so present for me right now, but as far as I remember it, it is still very much based on the concrete individual experience. And I think the experiential is still a kind of personalistic approach. And what my emphasis is refers to the fact that we are leaving the earth psychologically. You know? We are moving into outer space. We have already left the earth. We look down upon the world from outer space, satellites and so on. You know? And so for this new situation, we need a different kind of psychology. The soul has itself left the earth through our leaving it. And leaving the earth also means leaving the body. Nature is not a reality for the soul anymore. Here we could even say that Dionysian dismemberment has already happened to nature. It has decomposed it, which doesn't mean that in private life, individual life, there are still powerful emotions, or that for artists, emotions are means of expressing something. But just like paintings are still a possible mode of expression and make use of the imaginal, but the modern paintings must, of course, address a completely different present-day reality. They cannot try to depict what was true in former ages. They have to be up to date.
Thank you.
Obrigado, Gustavo. Um grande abraço. Vamos para a última pergunta, Mr. Giegerich. Ieda, por favor.
Ok.
Uma honra estar aqui hoje. Muito obrigada, Marcos, André, professor Giegerich, minha amiga querida Kátia também. Eu gostaria de fazer uma pergunta, eu vou ler aqui rapidamente. No início da sua fala, o senhor usa o provérbio, metáfora da árvore e do bosque, né? Para embasar sua ideia da psicoterapia ainda centrar-se no dentro, no indivíduo, no subjetivismo e não no bosque. Minha pergunta é: quais as diferenças filosóficas e epistemológicas entre sua visão e a de Anima Mundi em James Hillman? Muito obrigada.
Could you say that again, the last sentence, Hillman's? Yeah. Oh, that's fine. Anima Mundi concept. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, I think this is a particularly problematic concept of Hillman's because I think it's sort of nostalgic. It's an idea that fits to former times, but doesn't really have any place in our modern world of physics and information technology. The Anima Mundi comes from ages that are sort of, when nature was still the Greek cosmos. But we don't have the cosmos, we have the universe of modern physics. Physics that has dissolved nature into atoms and all that, and this the Anima Mundi aspect, which goes along with a lot of feeling, is a beautiful idea, but I cannot connect it with where we are. And we know from one essential paper of Hillman's that he wanted to move from the modern universe back to the cosmos, the ancient cosmos. And I wrote a long critique of this paper in which I analyzed why it does not work. The essential thing that we are confronted with is that on the one hand, we have individual patients and we have to do justice to them, but our work with patients has very little to do with the soul. It's only concerned with the psyche, for the most part at least. But at the same time, as psychologists, we are called, in the Jungian tradition at least, we are called upon to pay attention to the soul, and the soul is historical. It has left behind certain former forms that existed in the past, and now we are entering into a completely new world situation, and our task will be to slowly adapt consciousness to this new situation. As I mentioned before, Jung had this important insight that psychological problems arise because consciousness has not been aware of how the world changed for it. And that it has to become aware of this and therefore change its attitude so that it can be adapted again to where the world, and that also means where the soul now really is.
Obrigado, Ieda.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Giegerich.
Well, I thank you all for your interest in my work and your listening to what I had to say. And I hope that these difficult ideas were, at least to some extent, for you understandable. And I wish you all the best. Thank you very much.
Mr. Giegerich, eu queria, de modo bastante atrevido, me permitir fazer a última pergunta para o senhor. É possível? O senhor começa o Vida Lógica, o senhor começa o Vida Lógica da Alma narrando um conto islandês sobre um jovem que lança arremessa uma lança para fora de casa, vai ao encontro dessa lança, arremessa novamente e vai construindo o mundo. Minha pergunta é: qual é a próxima lança do senhor a ser lançada?
Well, see, this story, I think, is connected with what I just said about adaptation. The lance, the spear that we have to throw is to throw out of the house into the world in order to get to where the world already is. And we have to move step by step. We cannot comprehend the world all at once. And I think it will probably take 100 or more years until we slowly understand a little more of how the world has changed and how our consciousness needs to change to be adapted to it. So it's not my idea that we make moves that change anything, but our moves are moves to catch up with what is already real.
Perfeito. Mr. Giegerich, obrigado pela sua presença, pela sua generosidade em ter aceito o nosso convite. Para nós é uma imensa alegria, nós sabemos o quão raros são as suas aparições públicas, mas nós estamos absolutamente felizes, satisfeitos e honrados pelo fato do senhor ter prestigiado o lançamento do seu livro em português. Muito obrigado pela sua presença e eu deixo com o senhor as últimas palavras para o senhor agradecer.
Well, I'm very impressed by what I sense as your interest in my work. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigado. Eu agradeço a todos a presença, acho que a gente teve um momento bastante rico, histórico para a comunidade junguiana, para a comunidade junguiana brasileira. Há muitos convidados internacionais do México, dos Estados Unidos, Espanha. Agradeço a presença de todos. Comprem o livro, leiam a obra de Wolfgang Giegerich e vamos adiante, atrás das lanças que foram arremessadas para fora do mundo. Tá bom? Um abraço a todos. Até a próxima.